Evan was not the kind of man who talked much. He had arrived at Veltara Prime 3 months ago with 2 bags, a worn tool belt, and no explanation for why he had left Earth behind. The colony was small, a few dozen buildings scattered across a flat stretch of land between 2 ridgelines, with a market in the center and a communal water station near the East Road. It was not a beautiful place. It was not an ugly one either. It was simply a place where different species had decided to build something together, and most days that worked well enough. Evan rented a small room above the grain storage building and started taking repair jobs around the colony. A broken door hinge here. A crack support beam there. He charged fair prices and never spoke more than necessary. People liked him well enough, though nobody really knew him. He was just the quiet human with the tool belt who showed up when something needed fixing. It was on his 4th week in the colony that he first noticed the cabin at the edge of the settlement. It sat a little apart from everything else, past the last row of proper buildings, close to where the flat land began to slope down toward the tree line. It was small, smaller than most storage sheds in the colony, and it looked like it had been repaired many times by many different hands, none of whom had done a particularly good job. The walls were a patchwork of different materials. Some sections were old timber, dark with age. Others were newer panels that did not quite match the rest. The roof was covered in overlapping scraps of metal sheeting held down by rocks and old bolts. The whole structure leaned very slightly to the left as if it was tired. Evan stood at the edge of the road and looked at it for a long time. He noticed the foundation first. The ground beneath the front left corner had shifted, leaving a visible gap between the base of the wall and the earth. That kind of gap let in cold air in winter and weakened the entire structural load on that side. Then he noticed the roof. The metal sheets were not sealed at the edges. Water would get underneath during heavy rain. Over time that would rot whatever wood was supporting the roof from below. Then he noticed the walls. The joints between the different sections were not properly fastened. Some were held together with what looked like wrapped wire. Wire was not a structural fastener. Wire would hold until it didn't. He stood there long enough that the cabin's front door eventually opened. A small dragon looked out at him. Evan had seen dragons before a few times at the larger transit stations between colony worlds. They were generally large creatures, scaled, broad-winged, physically impressive in a way that made most other species instinctively step aside. This one was not large. He was young, maybe 10 or 11 years old in dragon terms, which made him roughly equivalent to a young child by most species counting. His scales were a dull greenish-gray, and he was thin in the way that suggested he had not always eaten enough. His eyes were yellow-gold and looked at Evan with a careful, quiet suspicion. Evan raised one hand in a simple greeting and walked on. But he thought about that cabin for the rest of the day. That evening he pulled up the colony's weather database on his personal screen and started looking through the atmospheric data for Veltara Prime. It was something he did out of habit, the way other people checked news or messages. Weather had always mattered to him more than most things. He scrolled through the seasonal records, the pressure readings, the wind pattern histories. Then he found something that made him stop scrolling. There was a formation building in the upper atmosphere to the northwest. A slow, rotating pressure system that the colony's automated monitoring had flagged at a low-level alert and then quietly left sitting there for the past 11 days without escalation. Evan knew what that kind of formation looked like when it was young. He had seen it before. He did not like what the numbers were showing him. He sat with the data for a long time. Then he closed the screen and went to sleep. The next morning, before his first job of the day, he stopped at the colony's building supply yard and bought timber, anchor bolts, structural adhesive, and a roll of proper roof sealing material. He loaded it onto a small cart and walked it to the cabin at the edge of the settlement. The young dragon opened the door before Evan even knocked. Evan looked at him and said simply, "Your cabin needs work. I'm going to fix it." The young dragon stared at him. "I didn't ask you to." "No," Evan agreed. He began unloading the cart. The dragon, his name was Dusk as Evan would learn over the following days, stood in the doorway for a long while watching him work. He did not help. He did not tell Evan to leave either. He simply watched with those careful yellow-gold eyes as Evan crouched down at the front left corner and began clearing the gap between the wall base and the ground. Word spread through the colony quickly, the way word always does in small places. By the second day, people were walking past the cabin on their way to the market just to look. By the third day, they were stopping to comment. A group of galhuri, the large, stone-skinned species that made up about a third of the colony's population, stood at the road's edge one afternoon and watched Evan drilling anchor bolts into the cabin's foundation. One of them, a broad elder named Brog, crossed his thick arms and shook his head slowly. "What exactly is the human doing?" he asked, to no one in particular. Fixing the dragon child's cabin, someone answered. Brog made a low sound that was the Galhari equivalent of a laugh. That cabin is not worth the materials he is putting into it. The human bought them himself, another voice said. Brog's expression shifted into something between amusement and disbelief. He raised his voice just enough for Evan to hear clearly. Human. That structure is older than your presence on this planet. You are putting good bolts into a bad frame. And for what? A dragon child who does not even want your help. Evan did not look up. He kept drilling. Brog turned to the small crowd that had gathered and spread his large hands. You see? This is what humans do. They find something that is not their business and they make it their business. Several people laughed. A pair of Threxians clicked their mandibles together, which was their version of chuckling. The mockery did not stop after that. It became a daily feature of colony life. People called Evan the dragon's nanny. They said he was wasting time on a building that would fall down regardless. Some said it was strange, a grown human spending his evenings reinforcing a child's shed when there was real work to be done elsewhere. A few were not mean about it but simply puzzled, which sometimes felt worse. Dusk heard all of it. His cabin was close enough to the road that voices carried. Evan could see it on the young dragon's face, the tightness around his eyes, the way he held his wings slightly in when he came to the doorway. On the fourth evening, Dusk came and stood beside Evan while he worked on the roof joints. They are laughing at you, Dusk said quietly. I know, Evan said. Does it bother you? Evan thought about it honestly. A little, he said. But not enough to stop. Dusk was quiet for a moment. Then, why are you doing this? You don't know me. Evan set down his tool and looked at the young dragon directly for the first time since they had met. Dusk was small, standing there in the evening light, with his thin frame and his careful eyes and his cabin that had been patched together by nobody in particular because nobody in particular had thought he was worth the proper effort. You needed it done, Evan said simply. And I can do it. He picked his tool back up and went back to work. Dusk stood there a moment longer. Then he went inside and came back out with a second tool from somewhere, a basic clamp that was not quite right for what Evan was doing but showed the intention clearly. He held it out. Evan took it without making a big moment of it. He showed Dusk where to hold it and they worked together quietly until the light was gone. That night, alone in his room, Evan opened the weather database again. The pressure formation to the northwest had grown. It was rotating faster now. The numbers had moved in the direction he had hoped they would not. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he started writing down everything he would need to finish the cabin before the week was out. Evan spent the whole night with the weather data. He did not sleep. He sat at the small desk in his room above the grain storage building with his screen open and a cup of cold tea beside him that he forgot to drink. He ran the numbers 3 times because he wanted to be wrong. He was not wrong. The pressure formation to the northwest was not a seasonal shift or a minor weather event. It was rotating, deepening, and pulling warm air up from the southern thermal belt in exactly the pattern that preceded the worst kind of storm a colony planet could experience. A Class 7 spiral storm. Evan had only seen the aftermath of one in his life and that was enough. He had been a structural safety engineer on a mid-sized colony called Ferron Station years ago, before he came to Veltara Prime. Ferron Station had received the same kind of early warning data, the same quiet pressure readings sitting in the same low-level alert category that nobody escalated. The engineers had flagged it. The council had reviewed it and decided the models were being overcautious. The storm had arrived 4 days later and taken 11 buildings and 9 lives with it. Evan had stood in the wreckage afterward and made himself remember every detail. He was not going to let that memory sit unused. By morning he had prepared a full analysis, clear, simple, and organized. He printed it on 2 sheets and wrote the key numbers at the top in large text so nobody could miss them. Wind speed projections. Pressure drop timeline. Estimated landfall window. Recommended preparation steps. He had kept it simple on purpose. He did not want anyone to have an excuse to say it was too complicated to understand. The colony council met every week in the main hall near the center of the settlement. Evan arrived early and asked the door attendant, a young Threxian who looked surprised to see him, if he could speak to the council before the regular meeting began. The attendant went inside and came back a few minutes later and nodded. The council chamber was not a grand room. It had a long table, several mismatched chairs, and a window on the east side that let in the morning light. 5 council members were already seated when Evan walked in. Brog sat at the far end, large and settled, like a boulder that had decided to become a chair. Beside him was Sevka, the colony's Threxian administrator, sharp-eyed, with her data pad already in her hand. The other three were a mixed group Evan recognized by sight but had never spoken to directly. Evan placed his printed analysis on the table and waited until he had their attention. Then he explained it clearly and without drama. He told them about the pressure formation. He showed them the rotation data and the speed at which it was deepening. He explained what a Class 7 spiral storm meant in practical terms. Sustained winds strong enough to destroy standard colonial construction, rainfall heavy enough to flood low-lying foundations, and a duration that would likely keep the colony cut off from outside communication for at least 48 hours. He told them the estimated landfall window was 4 days from now, possibly less if the southern thermal current continued accelerating. He pointed to the recommended steps at the bottom of his sheet. Reinforce or evacuate the weakest structures. Secure loose materials across the settlement. Stock the central hall with emergency supplies as a fallback shelter. Contact the regional colonial authority now before communication became difficult. He finished speaking and waited. Brog looked at the printed sheet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and made that low sound again, the one that meant he found something amusing. A Class 7, he said. On Veltara Prime. Yes, Evan said. Veltara Prime has not recorded a Class 7 event in over 60 years of colonial weather history, Brog said. He said it in the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should already know it. 60 years is not a long record, Evan said. And the formation does not care about the colony's history. Brog looked at him with patient, heavy amusement. Human. I have lived on this planet for 23 years. I know its weather. I know its seasons. I know the way the sky looks before a serious storm and the way it looks before a passing one. He gestured toward the east window where the morning was calm and pale. What I see out there is not a Class 7 event. You cannot see a Class 7 event 4 days before it arrives, Evan said. That is why the data exists. Sevka set down her data pad and folded her hands on the table. She had a precise, careful way of speaking that made everything she said sound like a final decision. I have reviewed similar pressure models in my 12 years of administrative work across 3 colony systems, she said. What you are describing is a pattern that human meteorological models consistently overweight. The margin of error in cross-planetary atmospheric projection at this range is significant. What your data is more likely showing is a Class 3 or Class 4 weather event, unpleasant, worth monitoring but not an emergency. I accounted for projection margin of error in the analysis, Evan said. It is noted on the second sheet. Sevka glanced at the second sheet without picking it up. I appreciate your concern, she said in a tone that did not sound particularly appreciative. The Council will continue to monitor the weather beacon data through standard channels. One of the other Council members, a Galhari younger than Brog with lighter-colored skin, leaned toward his neighbor and said something quietly. His neighbor pressed a hand over their mouth. They were trying not to smile. Evan saw it. He kept his face still. I want the record to show that I brought this warning formally, Evan said. Today's date, this Council, this data. Noted, Sevka said, already writing something on her pad. Brog stretched his large arms and looked around the table with easy satisfaction. Tell me, he said not unkindly, but with the full weight of his amusement behind the words, is this the same human who has been spending his evenings reinforcing a dragon child's shed at the edge of the settlement? Nobody answered because nobody needed to. Brog nodded slowly. First he baby-proofs a dragon's hut. Now he wants to baby-proof the whole colony. He looked at Evan with something that was almost friendly. Human. Go back to your repair work. Let the weather beacon do its job. If the numbers change significantly, the Council will act. Evan picked up his printed sheets from the table. He folded them once and put them in his jacket pocket. He looked at each Council member for a moment, not with anger, just with the quiet, steady look of someone recording a moment they will need to remember later. Then he thanked them for their time and walked out. The morning air outside the Council hall was calm and cool. A few colonists were opening their market stalls across the road. Someone was laughing about something near the water station. It was an ordinary morning and everyone was moving through it like it would be followed by an ordinary afternoon. Evan stood on the step outside the hall for just a moment. Then he turned and walked directly to the building supply yard. He bought more anchor bolts, a second roll of roof sealing material, 2 additional timber beams, and a collection of heavy storm shutters designed for high wind conditions. He spent more than he had planned to spend. He loaded everything onto the cart and walked it to the edge of the settlement without stopping. Dusk was already outside when he arrived, sitting on the front step of the cabin in the morning light. He watched Evan pull the cart up and looked at the new materials with his careful yellow-gold eyes. The council said no? Dusk asked. Evan looked at him. How did you know I went to the council? Small colony, Dusk said simply. Evan almost smiled. He started unloading the cart. They said no. Dusk was quiet for a moment. Then, what does that mean for the cabin? It means we work faster, Evan said. He handed Dusk a clamp and pointed to the corner beam that needed holding while he positioned the first new timber. Dusk took the clamp without being asked twice and moved to the right spot without needing to be shown. He was learning quickly. Evan had noticed that from the beginning. The young dragon watched carefully and remembered what he saw. They worked through the morning without speaking much. At one point a group of colonists passed on the road and one of them called out something about the human and his dragon project. A few others laughed. Dusk's grip on the clamp tightened slightly. Evan did not look up from his work. Ignore it, Evan said quietly. Easy for you to say, Dusk said. No, Evan said. It isn't. But we do it anyway. Dusk said nothing more. He held the beam steady and Evan drove the bolt home, and the cabin grew a little stronger, and outside the colony the sky to the northwest had begun, very faintly, to turn the color of old amber. The morning of the last day before the storm was the quietest Evan had felt in weeks. Not because things were calm, but because everything that could be done to the cabin was almost done, and the list in his head was finally getting shorter instead of longer. He arrived at Dusk's cabin before sunrise with a lantern and a thermos of hot water and got straight to work on the roof shutters while the rest of the colony was still sleeping. Dusk appeared in the doorway not long after, scales still dull with sleep, blinking in the lantern light. He looked at Evan working on the roof without a word and disappeared back inside. A few minutes later he came back out with his clamp and took his position at the corner beam without being asked. Evan noticed. He said nothing about it. But he noticed. The roof shutters were the last major piece. Evan had designed them to fold down over every window and the main door frame, locking into brackets he had bolted into the outer walls 2 days earlier. When closed they formed a second layer over every opening, not pretty, not light, but solid. The kind of solid that did not move when the wind decided it wanted to go somewhere. They worked through the early morning in the easy quiet of people who have gotten used to working together. Dusk had become genuinely useful over the past several days. Not just holding things in place but anticipating what came next, passing the right tool before Evan asked for it, spotting a loose joint on the west wall that Evan had almost missed. For a child who had been living alone in a broken cabin, he had good instincts. By mid-morning they moved underground. The shelter beneath the cabin floor had been Evan's idea from the beginning. It was not large, just enough space for several people to sit without touching the ceiling, with a reinforced hatch above and walls dug into the solid clay beneath the foundation. Evan had lined the walls with flat stones to prevent collapse and laid a simple wooden floor to keep the ground moisture out. Over the past few days he had stocked it carefully, sealed containers of water, dried food for 4 days, a battery lantern, a basic medical kit and 2 heavy blankets. Dusk climbed down into it and looked around. It's small, he said. It's strong, Evan said. Dusk ran one claw along the stone wall. How many people can fit? 6 comfortably, Evan said. 8 if nobody complains. Dusk looked up at the hatch above them. Do you think anyone will come? Evan climbed back up without answering right away. He checked the hatch seal, pressed it closed, opened it again, checked it once more. Then he looked down at Dusk still standing in the shelter below. I hope so, he said. They finished the last of the work just before noon. Evan walked the full outside of the cabin 3 times, checking every bolt, every seal, every anchor point. He pressed his hand flat against each wall section and felt for any give or movement. There was none. The structure that had been leaning slightly to the left when he first saw it 3 weeks ago was now straight, anchored, and sealed. It looked different from everything around it, not because it was beautiful but because it looked like it meant to stay standing. He stood back and looked at it. Dusk came and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Evan folded his arms and said, "Good cabin." Dusk looked at it. Something shifted in his expression, quiet and careful, the way feelings moved across his face when he was not sure what to do with them. It doesn't even look like the same building, he said. It isn't, Evan said. Not really. He gave Dusk simple and clear instructions before he left for the afternoon. Keep the shutters open for now but know exactly how to close and lock each one. Keep the shelter hatch accessible, nothing stacked on top of it. If the wind picks up fast, close everything and get underground and stay there until the sound stops. Do not go outside once it starts for any reason. Dusk listened to every word with the focused attention he always gave to things that mattered. Then Evan picked up his printed warning sheets and walked into the colony. He had made 30 copies the night before on the colony's shared printing station. 1 page each, clear and simple, the storm data at the top, the landfall window in large numbers in the middle, and 5 recommended steps at the bottom written in plain language that any species in the colony could understand. He had translated the key points into 3 common colonial languages as well, using the basic translation function on his screen. He started at the north end of the settlement and worked his way south. Most colonists took the sheet politely. Some looked at it, nodded, and set it aside in the way people set things aside when they have already decided not to think about them. A few asked genuine questions. One older Threxian farmer named Pesh held the sheet close to his eyes and read every line carefully and then asked Evan to explain the pressure readings in simpler terms. Evan sat with him on his front step for 10 minutes and explained it in the simplest terms he had. Pesh asked 2 sharp, intelligent questions. By the end he was nodding slowly in the way of someone who has understood something they did not particularly want to understand. A young Galhari mother named Nora answered her door with a child standing behind her and took the sheet with both hands and read it immediately, right there in the doorway. She asked how long the shelter window would last if the storm ran long. Evan told her. She thanked him and closed the door, and he could hear her moving things around inside before he had even reached the next cabin. A quiet alien mechanic named Gil took his sheet, read it once, looked at the sky and said nothing. But his eyes were serious and he folded the sheet neatly and put it in his front pocket instead of setting it down. Then Evan reached Brog's house. It was one of the largest structures in the colony, stone-accented walls, a wide roof, built with the confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that a building could fail him. Brog answered the door himself, which Evan had not expected. He was a big presence even in a doorway. Evan held out the warning sheet. Brog looked at it. Then he took it, and for one moment Evan thought he was actually going to read it. Instead, Brog tore it cleanly in half, top to bottom, and held the 2 pieces out toward Evan like he was returning something that did not belong to him. "I gave you my answer yesterday in the council chamber," Brog said. Not cruelly, simply. As if the matter was closed and had been closed and would remain closed. Evan took the 2 halves. He folded them together and put them in his pocket. "The offer stands regardless," he said. Brog looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was not quite mockery this time, something older and less comfortable than that. Then he closed the door. Sefka was last. She met Evan outside the administrative office rather than letting him inside, which told him she had been watching for him. She took the sheet, glanced at it, and then looked at him with her precise, settled expression. "I am formally asking you," she said, "to stop distributing these. You are creating anxiety in the colony over a projection that our monitoring systems have not escalated beyond a yellow advisory. The monitoring system is set to escalate at thresholds that are too high for early preparation to be useful," Evan said. "That is not your determination to make," Sefka said. "I know," Evan said. "I made it anyway." Sefka held his sheet out to him. He did not take it. After a moment she set it on the low wall beside her and went back inside. Evan walked back through the colony toward the edge of the settlement. The market was still going. Children were playing in the road. A group of Galhari were finishing the road repair work on the far side of the settlement, laughing about something among themselves. It was an ordinary afternoon and the colony was living inside it like nothing was coming. He passed Pesh's house on the way back. Through the window he could see the old Threxian moving supply containers toward the back of his interior room. Nora's cabin had its ground-level shutters already partially closed. Gil's workshop was dark and locked, which it had not been when Evan passed it an hour ago. 3 people. Out of 30 visited. He told himself 3 was better than none and kept walking. He reached Dusk's cabin as the sun was going down. Dusk was sitting on the front step looking northwest. The sky in that direction had been amber for 2 days. Now it was something darker, a deep bruised color that sat low on the horizon like a held breath. Dusk said, "It's getting darker faster than yesterday." "Yes," Evan said. "Is that bad?" "Yes," Evan said. He sat down on the step beside Dusk and they both looked at the horizon together in silence. The colony behind them was full of ordinary evening sounds. Someone cooking, a door closing, distant conversation. Ordinary sounds from people who did not know yet. Then it came. Not thunder. Not wind. Something lower and steadier than either of those things. A deep, continuous sound that seemed to come from the ground as much as the sky, like something enormous had started breathing in the far distance and had not stopped. Dusk went very still beside him. Evan stood up slowly and looked northwest. The dark color on the horizon was moving. Not fast, but moving. "Close the shutters," he said quietly. "All of them." Then come inside. Dusk was already moving before Evan finished the sentence. The storm did not announce itself. One moment the night was dark and still, with that low distant roar sitting on the edge of hearing like something not quite real. Then the wind arrived, not building slowly, not giving anyone time to adjust. Just suddenly there, full and enormous and pressing against every surface like it had decided the colony did not belong where it was standing. Evan was already awake. He had not slept. He had sat in the main room of Dusk's cabin through the night with his back against the reinforced wall and his lantern turned low, listening to the roar grow from distant to close to everywhere. He had his tools beside him, his jacket on, and the shelter hatch at his feet checked and ready. Dusk had fallen asleep on the floor near the back wall sometime around midnight, curled tight with his wings folded over himself like a second blanket. When the wind hit, Dusk's eyes opened immediately. He did not panic. He sat up and looked at Evan and Evan gave him one nod, the kind that meant everything is holding, stay calm, and Dusk pulled his wings in and stayed where he was. The cabin groaned. The sound was deep and structural, the sound of a building being tested by something that did not care about it. The roof beams flexed under the pressure and the storm shutters shook in their brackets with a rattling that was constant and loud. But the anchor bolts held. The sealed joints held. The triple-layered roof connections that Evan had drilled into bedrock held. The cabin groaned like something alive and straining, but it did not move. Outside, the colony was not holding. Evan could hear it through the walls, sounds that did not belong to wind alone. A tearing sound that went on too long. A crash that was heavy and final. Another crash, further away then closer. The kind of sounds that meant roofs and walls were losing the argument with the storm. Then the power went out. It happened between 1 second and the next. The faint glow of the colony's light grid visible through the sealed shutter edges simply stopped. The weather beacon went dark. Everything outside became noise and black. Evan lit the battery lantern. The cabin filled with steady yellow light. Dusk looked at him. How bad is it out there? Bad, Evan said honestly. There was no point in softening it. They sat together in the noise. The wind found every edge it could, pressed under the door, pushed against the shutters, moved along the roof looking for a way in. It did not find one. Evan had not left it one. The first knock came about an hour after the storm hit. It was hard to hear over the wind, just a faint, desperate banging that Evan almost missed. He crossed to the door and pressed his ear against it and heard it again. He opened the door. The wind came in like a living thing, cold and wet and immediate. Standing outside in it were Pesh and his family, the old Threxian farmer, his daughter and 2 small children. They were soaked completely through, leaning into the wind just to stay standing. Pesh's face was cut above one eye from something that had hit him in the dark. Evan pulled them inside. All 4 of them. He pushed the door shut against the wind and bolted it. Pesh looked around the cabin. At the walls that were not moving. At the roof that was not lifting. He put one hand flat against the nearest wall and held it there for a moment like he needed to feel it to believe it. Your cabin, he said, breathing hard. It's the only thing still standing on the north road. Sit down, Evan said. There's water in the shelter. The second knock came 20 minutes later. Nor. The young Galhuri mother, with her child pressed against her side, her other arm wrapped around the child's head to shield it from the debris that was moving through the air outside. She was bleeding from a cut on her forearm. Her cabin's roof had gone in the first 30 minutes, she said. She had grabbed her child and run. Evan opened the door and brought them in. Gil arrived next, the quiet mechanic, alone, soaked, with a deep expression that said he had seen things in the dark that he was not ready to talk about yet. He came inside and sat in the corner and said nothing, which was very much like him, except that he watched everything with wide, alert eyes. Then came people Evan did not know well. A Threxian couple from the east side of the colony whose names he had never learned. A young Galhuri man who could not stop shaking. An older alien woman who sat down on the floor immediately and pressed her hands flat on the wooden boards like she was grateful just to feel something solid beneath her. Evan opened the door every time. Every single time, without discussion, without hesitation. The cabin was getting crowded. People sat wherever there was space, against walls, on the floor, in the corners. It was warm from the bodies and loud from the storm, and the lantern threw moving shadows across faces that were frightened and exhausted and relieved all at the same time. Dusk moved quietly among them, not speaking much, but present. He brought water from the shelter. He made space for the Threxian children by moving himself to a smaller corner. When one of the small children started to cry from the noise, Dusk sat close to them without being asked and said nothing but stayed there, solid and calm, until the crying slowed. Evan watched him do it and said nothing. But he stored the image away. The storm was at full strength now. The sounds from outside were not individual crashes anymore, they had merged into one continuous, layered roar that pressed against the walls without stopping. At one point a large object struck the east side of the cabin, something heavy and fast, and the whole structure shuddered from the impact. Several people gasped. Evan put his hand on the east wall immediately and felt it. Solid. The shudder had been from the impact, not from structural failure. He said, "It's fine." The wall held. And somehow, in that cabin full of frightened people, the calm steadiness of his voice was enough to settle the room back down. Then came the knock that was different from the others. It was slower. Heavier. Not desperate the way the others had been, more like something that had used up most of its energy getting to the door and had very little left for the knocking. Evan crossed to it and opened it. Brog stood in the doorway. He was almost unrecognizable. The broad, stone-skinned elder who had stood in the town square and called Evan, the human who babies a dragon, who had torn the warning sheet in half without reading it, stood soaked and diminished in the storm light. His upper arm was held against his body at a careful angle that meant it was either badly bruised or broken. There was debris caught in the thick material of his outer coat. His face had the particular emptiness of someone who has watched something they were certain of become completely untrue. He did not speak. He did not explain. He did not apologize. He just stood there in the wind and the dark, looking at the door of the small dragonchild's cabin that was still standing when his own proud home was not. Evan looked at him for one moment. Then he stepped aside. Brog came in. He had to duck his large frame through the doorway. He stood inside and the door closed behind him and the wind was shut out again. The crowded room looked at him, some with surprise, some with an expression too tired for surprise. Brog looked at the walls, at the sealed shutters, at the lantern burning clean and steady in the center of the room. Then he looked at Dusk. The young dragon was standing near the back wall, watching him with those careful yellow-gold eyes. The cabin that Brog had called not worth the materials used on it. The dragon child that Brog had called something that did not need looking after. Dusk held Brog's look for a moment. Then he moved to the side to make more space. Not as a statement. Not to make a point. Simply because there was a person in front of him who needed somewhere to stand. Brog lowered himself slowly to the floor. He sat with his injured arm held carefully and his eyes down and said nothing. The storm pressed against the cabin walls without stopping. The anchor bolts held. The sealed joints held. The reinforced roof beams held. Everything that Evan had drilled and bolted and sealed across 2 weeks of being laughed at held through the worst of it, hour after hour, while outside the colony came apart in the dark. And inside the small dragon's cabin that nobody had thought was worth fixing, 13 people sat together in the lantern light and waited for morning. It happened in the deepest part of the night. The storm had been going for hours and the people inside the cabin had settled into a kind of exhausted stillness. Not sleep, not quite, but the heavy quietness that comes when fear has been sitting in your body for too long and your muscles have given up trying to stay ready. Some were leaning against walls. The Threxian children had actually fallen asleep, pressed against Pesha's side. Nora sat with her child in her lap, eyes open, staring at nothing. Gil had not moved from his corner but his breathing had slowed. Even Brog, sitting on the floor with his injured arm held carefully across his chest, had his eyes half closed. Evan had not stopped listening. He sat near the center of the room with his back straight and his attention on the walls and roof the way a doctor keeps attention on a patient. Not tense, not relaxed, just continuously present. He had been tracking every sound the cabin made for hours. He knew which groan came from which beam. He knew the particular rattle of the northeast shutter and the lower sound the west wall made when a strong gust hit it at a specific angle. He knew all the sounds the cabin made when it was holding. So when the new sound came he heard it immediately. It was not loud at first. A sharp, high crack from the southeast corner, the kind of sound that a bolt makes when something has hit it with more force than it was designed to absorb. Then a second sound beneath it, lower and slower, the sound of a beam shifting by a small amount in a direction it was not supposed to shift. Evan was on his feet before the second sound finished. He crossed to the southeast corner and pressed both hands against the wall. He could feel it, a very slight movement, almost nothing, the kind of movement that most people would not notice and that Evan noticed like a shout. He grabbed the lantern from the center of the room and held it close to the corner joint. The anchor bolt at the base of the southeast corner beam had a crack running across its upper flange. Not a full break, not yet, but a crack that was active, meaning it was under load and the load was not going to decrease while the storm was still running. If the bolt gave way completely the corner beam would shift, the roof connection on that side would lose its anchor, and the southeast section of the roof would begin to separate. Evan turned to the room. He kept his voice calm and clear and not loud. I need someone to hold the southeast corner beam. Right now. Press against it and hold it steady while I work on the bolt. He said it to the room generally because he was already turning back to the corner and reaching for his tool belt. He did not know who would come. He half expected to have to ask again, more specifically. He did not have to ask again. Dusk was beside him in 4 seconds. The young dragon did not ask what was happening or how bad it was or what would happen if they could not fix it. He looked at the beam, looked at Evan, and pressed himself against it. His small scaled shoulder flush against the wood, his claws finding the joints in the wall behind it for grip, his feet planted wide on the floor for maximum resistance. Like this? Dusk asked. Evan looked at his position. He adjusted Dusk's left foot 2 inches to a better angle with one hand. Like that, he said. Don't move. I won't, Dusk said. Evan went to work. The cracked bolt needed to come out and be replaced. He had spare bolts in his kit. He had always carried spares, ever since Ferron Station, ever since the day he had needed something he did not have and could not get. He got the cracked bolt free in under 2 minutes, working fast and precise with the lantern wedged close. The beam shifted slightly when the bolt came out, a small stomach-dropping movement, and Dusk pressed harder without being told, his whole body leaning into the wood, claws tight. Still holding, Dusk said through his teeth. Good, Evan said. He had the replacement bolt positioned. 10 more seconds. He drove it in. 3 hard turns, then 4, then the satisfying resistance of metal biting fully into the anchor plate. He checked the tension twice. Then he put his hand flat on the wall above the joint and felt for movement. Nothing. Solid. He let out a slow breath. You can let go, he said. Dusk stepped back from the beam. His shoulder scales had pressed hard enough against the wood that there was a faint mark on them. He looked at the corner, then at Evan. Is it fixed? He asked. Yes, Evan said. Dusk looked at the corner for another moment. Then he went and sat back down in his space near the wall, pulled his wings around himself, and that was all. No speech. No drama. Just a young dragon who had done what needed doing and was now done with it. The room had been watching. Evan had not noticed during the repair, but now he saw it. Everyone awake, everyone looking at the corner, at Dusk, at the beam that had held. Pesh had both hands flat on the floor, braced, ready to do something, though what that would have been was unclear. Nora had her child held tight. Gil was standing, not in his corner anymore. Brog was looking at Dusk. His expression was not readable in the lantern light. But he was looking at the small dragon, the child he had dismissed, whose cabin he had mocked, whose home he was now sitting in, and whatever was moving through that large, stone-skinned face was not amusement. The storm ran for 3 more hours after that. Nobody slept again. They sat together in the crowded, warm, lantern-lit cabin and listened to the storm do its worst outside and felt the walls hold and kept their thoughts to themselves. At some point someone passed around the water containers from the shelter below. At some point Nora's child fell asleep again. At some point the Threxian couple held hands and stopped pretending they were not frightened. Evan sat near the southeast corner for the rest of the night, one hand resting on the wall beside the new bolt, monitoring it continuously. It held. Then, sometime in the early morning, the sound changed. It happened slowly, so slowly that at first nobody was sure they were hearing it correctly. The roar that had been constant and total and everywhere began to pull back, like something enormous withdrawing. The pressure against the shutters lessened by a degree. Then another. The deep grinding sound from the sky became higher, then thinner, then intermittent. The gaps between strong gusts grew longer. The rain, which had been a continuous weight against the roof, became irregular. Heavy bursts with quiet moments between them. Then the quiet moments grew longer than the bursts. And then it was over. Not dramatically. Not with a final gust or a last crash. The storm simply ran out, the way storms do when nobody is watching the exact moment. 1 minute it was there and the next minute the world outside was wet and gray and completely, overwhelmingly still. Nobody moved at first. Then Evan stood up and went to the door and opened it. Cold gray morning air came in, clean and damp and real. He stepped outside and stood on the front step and looked at the colony. It was very quiet. And it was broken. The north road had 3 structures with no roofs. The colony's central hall had its east wall down, rubble spread across the road in front of it. Market stalls were gone completely, just foundations and scattered materials where they had been. Brog's house, visible from Dusk's cabin at the edge of the settlement, had lost its entire upper section. The stone-accented walls he had been so proud of stood open to the gray sky like something that had been split apart and left where it fell. One by one the people inside came out. They stood on the step and in the small yard in front of the cabin and looked at what the storm had done. Some were silent. Some made quiet sounds in their own languages that did not need translation. Nora held her child's face gently away from the worst of it. Then other colonists began to appear. They came from the damaged buildings, from the structures that had partially survived, from emergency shelters that had held, from whatever corners they had found to wait out the night. They came into the road and they looked around and they looked at each other. And then they looked at Dusk's cabin. Standing clean. Shutters intact. Wall straight. Roof complete. The only structure in the visible colony that looked exactly the same as it had the day before. The crowd gathered slowly the way crowds do after disasters. Not organized, not purposeful, just people moving toward other people because standing alone in the wreckage was too hard. They gathered in the road in front of the cabin and they looked at it and they looked at Evan standing on the step. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Brog came out of the cabin last. He moved carefully because of his arm, ducking through the doorway with the stiff caution of someone whose injury had settled overnight and was now making itself fully known. He straightened up outside and looked at his own home across the settlement, at the open roofless walls, at the rubble. He stood with that sight for several seconds. Then he turned and walked toward Evan. The gathered colonists went quiet. Brog was a large presence, even injured and diminished. He walked to where Evan stood on the step and stopped in front of him. They were face to face, close enough that there was no missing anything in either expression. Brog did not build up to it. He did not make a speech. He did not explain himself or list his reasons or try to frame it in any way that made it easier. He said, "You were right. I was wrong. I'm sorry." 5 words. Then 4. Then 3. Said in the flat, undecorated tone of someone who has decided the only way through something is straight through it. The road was silent. Evan looked at him for a moment. There was no satisfaction in his face. No relief either, particularly. Just the quiet steadiness of someone who had spent 2 weeks doing the right thing without any guarantee that it would matter, and was now standing in the proof that it had. "Let's rebuild," Evan said. He meant it immediately and practically. Look at what needs doing, start there, move forward. But it landed in the quiet road like something larger than just a construction plan, and everyone present seemed to feel it. Brog nodded once. Behind Evan, the door of the cabin opened and Dusk stepped out. He stood beside Evan on the step and looked at the colony, at the ruins and the gathered people and the gray morning sky that was already beginning to lighten at its edges. Nobody laughed at the small dragon or his cabin. Nobody had anything to say about the human who had reinforced it. They just stood in the quiet together, in front of the one building that had held, and the morning came in around them slowly, and it was enough. The assessment team arrived 2 days after the storm. There were 4 of them, sent from the Regional Colonial Authority in response to the emergency signal that Sevka had finally transmitted the morning after the storm, once outside communication had been restored. They came in a gray utility transport that landed on the flat ground east of the settlement, and they stepped out with data pads and measuring equipment and the brisk, professional manner of people who had seen storm damage before and knew how to move through it efficiently. Their lead engineer was a tall woman named Ada. Human, older than Evan, with short gray hair and the particular kind of calm that comes not from a quiet life but from a very busy one that has taught you not to waste energy on unnecessary reactions. She shook Evan's hand when Sevka introduced them and looked at him with the straightforward attention of someone who was already curious about what she had heard. She had heard about the cabin before she landed. The emergency signal Sevka had transmitted had included a brief damage summary, and the summary had contained one detail that the regional office had found unusual enough to flag. One structure in the colony had survived the Class 7 event without any structural damage at all. Not partial survival. Not minor damage. None. Ada wanted to see it first. Evan walked her to it without saying much on the way. The cabin sat at the edge of the settlement exactly as it always had. Small, a little apart from everything else, close to where the flat land sloped toward the tree line. The storm shutters were still closed on 2 sides. The yard in front was wet and had some debris scattered across it from the colony's damage, materials that had blown from elsewhere and landed here. But the cabin itself was untouched. Ada walked around it once without speaking. She ran her hand along the wall joints. She crouched at the foundation corners and looked at the anchor bolts. She pulled one shutter open and examined the bracket system behind it. She pressed both palms flat against the wall and pushed, the way Evan had done dozens of times during construction. Then she stood back and looked at the roof. "Triple anchor on the beams," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Evan said. "Drilled to bedrock?" 60 centimeters down on the corner bolts. 40 on the mid-spans. Ada looked at the roof line for another moment. "What materials?" "Colony supply yard stock," Evan said. "Nothing special. Standard timber, standard bolts, standard ceiling compound. The design did the work, not the materials. Ada turned and looked at him directly. You built this by hand? No equipment beyond basic tools? Myself and the cabin's owner, Evan said. He held beams. Ada looked past Evan toward the cabin door, where Dusk was standing in the frame watching them with his careful yellow-gold eyes. Ada looked at the young dragon for a moment, at his size, at his age, and then back at Evan. She did not say anything immediately. She made a note on her data pad and kept walking. Her team spent the next 2 days measuring and recording every structure in the colony. They photographed the damage. They documented the failure points, which joints had gone first, which roof connections had pulled free, which foundations had shifted. They noted what materials had been used, what methods, what standards had been followed or not followed. It was thorough and systematic and completely without judgment, the way good engineering assessment always is. The buildings had failed or held based on physics, not on anyone's feelings about them. On the evening of the second day, Ada sat down with Evan at the table in the colony's partially repaired central hall and showed him the summary. 31 structures assessed. 19 with major damage, roofs gone or walls collapsed. 8 with moderate damage that required significant repair before safe habitation. 3 with minor damage. And 1 with no damage. She pointed to that last entry on her data pad. Dusk's cabin. Then she looked at Evan. In 14 years of post-storm assessment work, she said, I have seen a Class 7 event site twice before. I have never recorded a zero-damage structure at a Class 7 site. Not once. She paused. Until now. Evan said nothing. He looked at the data pad. The regional authority wants to know who designed and constructed the reinforcements, Ada said. I did, Evan said. I know, Ada said. I'm telling you formally because the formal answer has consequences. She set the pad down. The Colonial Authority is establishing a reconstruction initiative for Veltara Prime. New builds, rebuilt structures, updated safety standards across the whole settlement. They need someone to lead the engineering side of it. She looked at him steadily. They are asking if he will take the role. Evan was quiet for a moment. He thought about the night of the storm. About the sound the cracked bolt had made in the dark. About Dusk pressing his small body against the beam without being asked. About 13 people sitting on the floor of a cabin that everyone had laughed at, in lantern light, waiting for morning. Yes, he said. Ada nodded like she had expected that answer. She slid a second document across the table. Official authorization, resources, a team, proper standing with the Colonial Authority. Everything he had not had when he was working alone with a cart of supplies and a colony full of people making jokes behind his back. He signed it and she took it back and that was that. Sefka came to find him the following morning. She was formal about it, the way she was formal about everything, but there was something different underneath the formality, a careful quality like someone walking on ground they were not entirely sure about. She handed him a printed document and explained that the complaint she had filed against him for distributing unauthorized panic materials in the colony had been withdrawn, permanently removed from the record. In its place she had submitted a formal commendation. His name, the date, a clear description of what he had done and what it had resulted in. She held his eyes while she explained it. She did not look away. I reviewed the weather data again, she said. The data you presented to the council. I reviewed it against what actually occurred. Pause. Your projection was accurate to within 6 hours. I know, Evan said. Another pause. Longer this time. I should have listened, Sefka said. She did not add anything to it. She did not try to explain why she hadn't or list the reasons that had seemed valid at the time. She just said it plainly and waited. We build better from here, Evan said. Sefka nodded once. Then she walked away with her data pad under her arm and her back straight, already moving toward the next thing that needed doing. Brog did not make any speeches either. He simply showed up. The reconstruction work began on the third day after the assessment team's report was filed, and on that first morning Brog was there before most of the work crew, standing at the materials area, picking up beams, carrying them to where they needed to go. His arm was wrapped and he favored it, but he used his good arm without complaint and he did not wait to be directed. He looked at where the work was happening and he went there. He did this every day. He never mentioned the council meeting. He never mentioned the torn warning sheet. He did not try to explain himself to Evan or make the kind of long, public apology that would have been more about making himself feel better than about actually doing better. He just carried materials and followed the engineering instructions and showed up before he was asked to every single morning. Evan respected that more than any speech would have been. The colony changed in the way that real change happens, not all at once and not with announcements. Small things quietly. Nora stopped by Dusk's cabin one afternoon with a pot of food, enough for two, and left it on the step without making anything of it. Pesh began greeting Dusk by name in the market, which he had never done before. The Threxian couple whose names Evan had not known began stopping to talk when they passed the cabin on their morning walks. Gil said very little as was his way, but he appeared one day with a small wooden bench he had made and set it outside Dusk's front door without explanation. It was well made. The joints were clean and the wood was sanded smooth. He set it down and nodded once at Dusk and walked back to his workshop. Dusk put his hand on the bench and looked after Gil for a long moment. The forgotten child at the edge of the settlement was not forgotten anymore. Nothing official had been declared. Nobody had held a meeting about it or made a community decision. It had simply happened the way true things happen, because something real had occurred and it had changed the way people saw what was in front of them. On a quiet evening near the end of the first week of reconstruction, Evan came back to the cabin after a long day of work. His hands were dirty and his back was tired in the good way, the way that comes from doing useful things with your body. He sat down on Gil's bench outside the front door and leaned against the cabin wall and looked out at the settlement. The sounds of rebuilding filled the air, hammering and sawing and people calling instructions to each other across rooftops. New beams going up. The right way this time. Evan had made sure of that personally, going over every structural plan before a single bolt was driven. Dusk came and sat beside him. They looked at the work together without speaking for a while. The colony was damaged still, it would be weeks before the rebuilding was complete, but it was moving. It had direction now. Something had broken and something better was being put in its place. Dusk said, "Will you stay?" He asked it quietly, not looking at Evan, watching the reconstruction work the way you watch something you are not sure you are allowed to hope about. Evan looked at the new beams going up on the central hall. At the crew working on the North Road structures, following the specifications he had drawn up the night before. At the colony that had laughed at him for 3 weeks and then sheltered in the thing he had built and was now trusting him to help it build better. He looked at the small cabin behind them. At the bench out front. At the settlement that was no longer turning away from the young dragon at its edge. Someone has to make sure they build it right, he said. Dusk's small tail moved once, a single quiet flick. They sat together on the bench as the evening came in and the hammering slowly stopped for the day and the colony settled into the ordinary sounds of people ending their work and going home. They had mocked the human for strengthening a dragon's tiny cabin. They had laughed at the materials, at the effort, at the care given to something they had decided was not worth caring about. They had torn his warnings in half and voted to do nothing and called him a nuisance for trying. Then the storm came. And when it was over, the only ones who walked out uninjured were the ones he had quietly, steadily, without any fanfare or any guarantee, protected. Nobody was laughing now. And the humans stayed.